October 25th, 1944. 3 o'clock in the morning. Surigao Strait, the black water between the two islands of the southern Philippines. The USS West Virginia sat in the darkness, with her guns trained out into nothing, and the men on her deck knew exactly where she had been 2 years and 10 months earlier. She had been on the bottom. At Pearl Harbor, on the morning of December 7th, 1941, 7 torpedoes and 2 bombs had torn her open, and she had settled into the harbor mud with the bodies of her sailors still inside her. They had raised her. They had cut her apart, pumped her out, rebuilt her, and sent her back to war. And now, in the middle of the night, she was waiting in a strait most Americans could not have found on a map. She was, by the judgment of the modern Navy, obsolete, too slow, too old. A relic of another war, kept alive only because the fleet had found a use for slow, heavy ships, pounding beaches so the Marines could land. The fast, new battleships got the headlines, and the carrier task forces. Ships like the West Virginia got the leftovers. In the wardrooms, they were called the old ladies, and it was not a compliment. What the Japanese admiral steaming north into that strait in the dark did not know, what he could not have known as his flagship pushed toward Leyte Gulf, was that the written-off relics waiting at the far end of the water were about to do the single thing battleships had been built for a century to do, and would never do again after that night. This is the story of 6 old ships the Navy had almost given up on, of the admiral who sailed straight into them, and of the last time in the history of the world that steel battleships fought steel battleships in the dark. This is the story of the night the ghosts of Pearl Harbor got their answer. Part 1. The ships nobody wanted you. Have to understand how far these ships had fallen in the eyes of their own navy. When the war began, the battleship was the queen of the sea. By October 1944, the aircraft carrier had taken that crown, and everyone in the fleet knew it. Battles were being decided by planes launched from 100 miles away, over horizons the battleships could not see across. The great gun duel, 2 lines of steel hammering each other with shells the weight of a small car, belonged to the last war, to grainy photographs, to Jutland in 1916. It was history. It was finished. So the old battleships were given a second-line job. They were assigned to the invasion fleets, to sit off the beaches and fire their enormous guns at Japanese bunkers and gun positions ahead of the landings. It was vital work. It was not glamorous work. And it shaped a decision that would matter more that night than anyone realized. Because their job was to shell the shore, their magazines were packed mostly with high-explosive bombardment shells, the kind you fire at a beach, and only a limited number of the armor-piercing rounds you would need to punch through the hull of an enemy battleship. 6 of them gathered in Surigao Strait that night, under the command of Rear Admiral Jesse Oldendorf. West Virginia, Maryland, Tennessee, California, Pennsylvania, Mississippi. And here is the detail that turns a naval engagement into something closer to a reckoning. 5 of those 6 had been at Pearl Harbor on the morning of the attack. West Virginia and California had been sunk outright and raised from the mud. Tennessee, Maryland, and Pennsylvania had been battered and burned. Only the Mississippi had missed that morning. Think about what that means. 5 of the 6 ships waiting in the dark of Surigao Strait were literally the ships that Japan had tried to destroy at the very start of the war. They had been pulled off the bottom of an American harbor, stitched back together, and pointed west. The navy that Chester Nimitz commanded had almost written these ships off as too old to matter. They were about to matter more than any ship in the fleet. Part 2. The admiral sailing into the dark. Now turn the whole picture around and stand on the other bridge. Vice Admiral Nishimura commanded the Japanese Southern Force, and he was steaming his ships straight up Surigao Strait as one jaw of an enormous trap. The Japanese plan for the Philippines was desperate and intricate. 3 forces converging on the American landings at Leyte from 3 directions, gambling the last strength of the Imperial Navy on a single throw. Nishimura's job was to force the southern door, burst into Leyte Gulf, and smash the American transports there. His force was strong on paper. 2 battleships, the Yamashiro and the Fuso. Old ships themselves, but battleships. The heavy cruiser Mogami, 4 destroyers. And Nishimura pressed forward through the night with a grim, almost fatal steadiness. He had reason for that grimness. His own son, a young pilot, had been killed in the Philippines the year before. Men who studied Nishimura afterward came to believe he sailed into that strait already reconciled to how it would end. He was supposed to be one half of a pincer, arriving in coordination with a far larger force to the north. But the timing came apart. The coordination failed, and Nishimura, following orders and perhaps something colder than orders, kept going anyway, into a narrowing channel, at night, alone. Here is what he was sailing into. Surigao Strait is a funnel. To reach Leyte Gulf, his ships had to squeeze into a corridor of water, lined on both sides with land, a corridor that got tighter the farther in he went. And the Americans knew he was coming. They had known for hours. Oldendorf had taken his 6 old battleships and laid them in a line straight across the top of the funnel, across the exit, so that anything coming up the strait would run into the full broadside of every ship at once. There is a name for that position. Naval officers had dreamed about it for generations, and almost never achieved it. It is called crossing the T, and Nishimura was steaming his column directly into the crossed bar of it, in the dark, with no idea how completely the trap had already closed. But before his ships ever reached the battleships, they had to run a gauntlet, and the gauntlet came first. Part 3, the gauntlet. It started small, and it ended as a slaughter. First came the PT boats, small, fast, plywood torpedo boats, dozens of them scattered down the length of the strait. They darted in out of the darkness, fired and ran. Most of their torpedoes missed. That was almost beside the point. What they did was track Nishimura's every move and radio his position up the strait, so that by the time his ships pushed deeper, the Americans knew his course, his speed, and his exact place in the water. Then came the destroyers, and the destroyers were lethal. American destroyer squadrons swept down both sides of the strait in the black of night, closed the range, and launched torpedoes in coordinated waves. Dozens of them slicing through the water at Nishimura's column, while the Japanese lookouts strained to see anything at all. The torpedoes found the battleship Fuso first. They tore into her hull, and she staggered, fell out of the line, burning, and went down. A battleship killed before she had fired a meaningful shot at anything. The same torpedo attacks ripped through Nishimura's destroyers. 3 of them were hit, 1 blown apart, the others crippled and left dead in the water. In the space of minutes, before the real battle had even begun, the Japanese force had lost a battleship and most of its escort. The column that had entered the strait was being erased piece by piece by an enemy the Japanese could barely see. And still Nishimura pressed on. His flagship, the Yamashiro, drove up the strait through the wreckage of his own force, past the burning halves of his own ships, toward the top of the funnel. He would not turn. Whatever was waiting for him, he was going to reach it. He reached it at 3:50 in the morning, and that is when the ghosts opened fire. Part 4, Crossing the T. The West Virginia fired first. She had something the old label of obsolete completely concealed. One of the newest, most advanced fire control radars in the fleet, the Mark 8. In total darkness, with no moon and no searchlights, that radar reached out across the water, found the Yamashiro at more than 22,000 yards, nearly 13 miles, and locked on. The West Virginia's 8 16-inch guns, the same guns that had gone underwater at Pearl Harbor, swung onto a target her crew could not see with their eyes, and fired. The first salvo landed on the Yamashiro. Read that again. A ship that had been sunk at Pearl Harbor, raised from the mud, and dismissed as a relic, hit an enemy battleship with her opening salvo in pitch darkness from 13 miles away. Then Tennessee opened up. Then the Californians, both of them Pearl Harbor survivors, both carrying the same radar. Down the American line, the old battleships fired in turn, and because they were laid across the top of the strait, and Nishimura was pointed straight up into them, every American ship could fire its full broadside, while only the forward guns of the Yamashiro could answer. That is what crossing the T does. It lets your whole fleet shoot at an enemy who can barely shoot back. Naval officers had studied it in academies for 40 years, and almost none had ever lived it. Oldendorf's old ladies were living it, on the last possible night in history that it could ever happen. The shells came down on the Yamashiro in a torrent. She was hit again and again, her upper works torn open, fires breaking out along her length. She fought, she kept firing, she even landed hits. but she was one ship pointed the wrong way at the mouth of a trap, absorbing the broadsides of a battle line. American cruisers joined the barrage. Destroyers put torpedoes into her, and around 4:19 in the morning, the Yamashiro rolled over and went down, taking Admiral Nishimura with her into the water he had refused to turn away from. Of his entire force, almost nothing survived. The Fuso was gone, the Yamashiro was gone, the Mogami was a crippled, burning wreck that would be finished off later. 3 destroyers were destroyed. Only a single Japanese destroyer, the Shigure, managed to turn and escape down the strait into the dark. And there is one last detail, and it is the kind of detail this whole story turns on. Among the American battleships, the Mississippi fired one final full salvo late in the action. It was not the salvo that decided anything. It mattered for another reason entirely. When the Mississippi's guns fell silent, they became the last salvo ever fired by one battleship against another in the history of the world. No 2 battleships have duelled with their guns since. That door closed in Surigao Strait, in the dark, and it has never opened again. Part 5. The Verdict. So why did Nimitz's navy keep the ships it had almost thrown away, and why did the worthless old battleships win their one last fight? Start with the word worthless, because it was never true. It was a word about speed. The old battleships were slow, and in a war being fought by fast carriers, slow looked like useless. But the Surigao Strait was not a carrier battle. It was the one kind of fight where speed did not matter, and where everything the old ships still had, enormous guns, thick armor, and, quietly, the best gunnery radar in the fleet, was exactly, precisely what the moment demanded. The Navy had spent 2 years using these ships to shell beaches and calling them second line. On one night, in one narrow strait, the second line ships did something the entire glamorous fast fleet never got to do. They crossed the T and destroyed an enemy battle line. And then there is the thing underneath the tactics, the thing you cannot put in a gunnery report. 5 of those 6 ships had been at Pearl Harbor. 2 of them had been sunk there. The West Virginia and the California had lain on the bottom of an American harbor, while the country wondered whether it could even fight this war. They were pumped out, rebuilt, and carried across an ocean, and on the night of October 25, 1944, they fired the opening and closing shots that annihilated a Japanese battleship force. The ships Japan had tried to kill at the start of the war were the ships that closed the last battleship battle of it. There is no way to write that down as a coincidence and have it feel like one. Nishimura went down with his ship, sailing into a trap he may have already known was there, carrying whatever a father carries after he has lost a son to the same enemy. Oldendorf's crews watched a Japanese force come up the strait and cease to exist in front of their radar screens. And most of the men on both sides of that water were not admirals. They were kids in gun turrets and boiler rooms who had trained for a kind of battle almost no one believed would happen anymore. And then, for one night, it happened, and they were the ones who had to fight it. If your father, your grandfather, or your uncle served in the Pacific, on the old battleships, on the destroyers and PT boats that ran that strait in the dark, on any ship at Leyte Gulf, I would be honored to read their name and their unit in the comments. The men who were there are nearly all gone now. What remains is what their families still carry, and this is a place where it can stay in the record. And if this story gave you something to sit with, hit the like button. It keeps the memory of those 6 old ships in front of the people who care about the history the way it actually happened. Not the version that flatters, and not the version that flattens, but the one with the mud of Pearl Harbor still in it. They called them worthless. They called them old ladies. And on the last night in history that battleships ever fought battleships, the ships that had been raised from the bottom of the sea crossed the T, avenged the harbor that had nearly ended them, and closed a chapter of naval warfare that has stayed closed ever since. The old ships had one fight left in them. It turned out to be the only one that mattered.